Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be having a look at the naval part of the suggestions passed to developers for March of 2023. Obviously we had the April Fool's stuff, but that is kind of just, well, an April Fool's thing. They do like a proper one on top of it as well, and that's what we're having a look at today. We'll split the past to developer videos, as we usually do, into their sections, with the first one focusing on naval. Unfortunately, there was no helicopter stuff this time, so we can't really cover it. Hopefully next time there'll be a few additions. As always, if you enjoy the content, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and also like the video. Let's get started. The first vehicle is for America, and it's the USS Eldridge, the DE-173. This is a Cannon-class destroyer escort, which is kind of interesting. It's most famous for its involvement in the Philadelphia experiment. It was first built at Newark, New Jersey in 1943. During the Second World War, it served escorting men and resources across the Atlantic Ocean. However, the most interesting part of its history occurred on the 28th of October 1943, during an experiment known as the Philadelphia experiment, also sometimes referred to with Project Rainbow. There are several different claims about what happened during this experiment. According to legends, the goal of the experiment was to turn the vessel invisible to radar, and the story says it succeeded, but with a cost. The alleged experiment took place on the 28th of October 1943 at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. When it was performed, a green mist appeared and the Eldridge temporarily disappeared. This is where the claims start getting bizarre. Some say the ship reappeared at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, sometimes even going as far as saying it traveled through time, before disappearing again and reappearing back at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The creepiest rumor of all says that the experiment resulted in crew members going insane, getting sick, and some ending up fused to or inside parts of the ship. Books and a movie were released that popularized the stories, while the Navy denied the claims about the Philadelphia experiment. The story is mostly regarded as a hoax, but it's an interesting legend nonetheless. Going back to the more concrete and believable portion of the history, the USS Eldridge was placed in reserve in 1946. In 1951, the DE-173 was transferred to Greece and redesignated the HS Leon. Finally, the Eldridge, now Leon, was decommissioned on the 5th of November 1992 and scrapped in 1999. The vehicle has access to some interesting factors: 3 3-inch guns, 1 twin 40mm Bofors, 8 20mm Oerlikons, 3 21-inch torpedo tubes, a Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, and also some depth charge throwers as well. The next vehicle is for Britain, and it's the HMS Blake, which is part of the Tiger-class cruisers, which you may be very familiar with. The Blake can trace her lineage all the way back to the Second World War. She was originally laid down in 1942 as a Minotaur-class cruiser, but there were a low priority for the Royal Navy, so she stayed in construction until 1945. Interestingly, she briefly changed names to Tiger before going back to Blake. In 1945, her partially constructed hull was launched, but with the need for cruisers extremely diminished after the end of the war, and also the economic woes that ensued, she was almost immediately laid up again in 1946. It wouldn't be until 1954 that she resumed construction, but she was to be made to a new, more modern design. This, of course, would be the Tiger class. Blake and her sisters would be the victim of back-and-forth changing of design requirements and budgetary woes. To make a long story short, they ended up as anti-aircraft cruisers, relying on advanced fire control and powerful anti-aircraft cannons to hit their targets. This was predicated on the idea that guided shipborne missiles for anti-aircraft use would take a long time to develop, which was actually completely untrue. Blake was commissioned on the 18th of March 1961 as the last cruiser to be commissioned in the Royal Navy. That same year, Sea Slug and Sea Cat, 2 surface-to-air missile systems, would reach operational service. It was apparent almost immediately that Blake and her sisters had spent too long in the oven and would be rapidly outmodded, so the Royal Navy had to come up with a new use for them quickly. Similar to the American Des Moines class, the Newport News, Blake would be refit to serve as a flagship of sorts, with enhanced command and control equipment as well as extra crew space. In terms of her combat capabilities, she was repurposed as an anti-submarine warfare platform, and to this end, her aft guns were removed and replaced with a helicopter hangar which housed Westland Wessex and later Sea King helicopters. The forward guns were retained for surface bombardment and engaging light vessels, though this would never actually come to pass. Blake would not see combat use, though she was hardly inactive. In 1969, she helped to test the capabilities of the prototype Harrier VTOL aircraft, as well as operating in the Mediterranean in 1969 near Malta. She would return in 1971 for the withdrawal from Malta and visited the United States in the same year for British Day in San Francisco. Blake would also visit Key West at some point in 1978, one of her final actions. Blake and the Tiger were expensive to maintain and of questionable utility, but they also filled the ASW niche for the Royal Navy for a good 15 years. On the 6th of December 1979, Blake, the last cruiser remaining in the Royal Navy, was paid off and decommissioned. As she let loose a ceremonial salvo in the English Channel, she would also become the last Royal Navy vessel to fire a 6-inch gun. Blake and Tiger were laid up in 1980 and in 1981 were earmarked for disposal. It was apparently considered to recommission them for the Falklands conflict, but by the time they would have been ready to set sail, the war was already over, and she was scrapped soon after. Her ship's bell was the only element that was preserved. The next one is for Japan, and it is for the Akatsuki class destroyer, the Hibiki. The Hibiki was laid down on the 21st of February 1930 as the second destroyer of the class. The Akatsuki class destroyers are actually a subclass of the Fubuki class, and they were mainly just improved in a way of having better propulsion systems. The Hibiki itself was also one of the Type 3 improved series of the Fubuki destroyers. This meant that it had a modified main battery that would allow it to elevate to 75 degrees, so it could fire at air targets. The Hibiki joined the Imperial Japanese Navy from 1933 to 1947. It was then converted and demilitarized into a reparation ship and was handed to the USSR on the 5th of April 1947. It also had a bunch of nicknames during its service, including the unsinkable ship, the Phoenix, and also the destroyer having the destiny to survive the war. During her time in the Imperial Japanese Navy, she was in many battles, and throughout the war ended up surviving until the end, which is why she earned the nicknames. There are obviously many different ones. Near the end of the war, Japan knew that they were losing, and seeing as US was steaming across the ocean towards Japan, they were demilitarizing and dismantling pretty much everything related to the military, so when Japan would eventually fall to the Allies, they would not be able to reuse the shipyards and ships and etc., which included cutting apart towers, removing parts of armor plating, and all of that. In the 1970s, though, the ship finally met her fate as used as a target practice and sunk near Karamzina Island, and which is an accessible diving spot, so you can actually go and see the machine. According to general stuff, the vehicle was able to go 38 knots. It had 6 127mm guns, up to 22 25mm and 10 13mm AA guns, with 9 610mm torpedo tubes, and also depth charges on board as well. For Italy, we have a frigate, and it is the Luigi Rizzo, which is obviously part of the Luigi Rizzo class. This was actually made up of 4 units: the Luigi Rizzo, the Carlo Bengamini, the Virgilio Fassan, and the Carlo Margattini. The 4 units bore the names of as many famous sailors of the Royal Navy, decorated with a gold medal for military valor. Initially classed as a Type 2 fast corvette, and then later classed as frigates, they were the first escort units in the world to embark an anti-submarine helicopter, and also entered service between 1961 and 62. The construction was entirely in steel. The engine system was composed of 4 Tosi diesel engines that limited the speed. The armament, of all respects, for the time, was composed of 3 76/62mm Otto Melara cannons, 1 305mm Menon anti-submarine bomb launcher, 6 torpedo tubes, and then 1 AB-47 anti-submarine helicopter. The equipment for the electronics consisted of an AN/SPQ-2 surface radar, 1 AN/SBS-12 air radar, 2 RTN-10 fire radars, and then the Luigi Rizzo frigate was built in the Naval Meccanica shipyard in Castellammare di Stabia and entered service in 61. It served until 1980. And then we have a French ship. This is the Foch, a heavy cruiser which was part of the Suffren class. With the evolution of naval warfare during the First World War and the limitations imposed by the Washington Treaty in the 1920s, the French Navy decided to develop new classes of heavy warships to modernize its old fleet, which never got to finish its cancelled battleship classes. The Duquesne class was the first class of heavy cruiser of the French Navy, but while the development hadn't even begun construction, Italy had already begun the creation of their own better armoured cruisers, the Trento and Trieste classes. Therefore, a second class of heavy cruiser, opting for better armour, was being studied in 1924. The requirements for this class was a max displacement of 10,000, a specific armament of 203 cannons, millimeter cannons, the 75mm AAs, and then 550mm torpedoes, with a max speed of 30 knots at least, and enough protection to block 140mm shells, as well as enough durability to handle a torpedo hit or a 100-kilo bomb explosion. The Suffren class was born. 4 ships were going to be built in the following years: the Suffren, the Colbert, the Foch, and the Dupleix. The Foch was the first ship of the second batch to be built, and its construction, which began a bit later, took into account the fast evolution of heavy cruiser designs from rivals, especially Italy. As such, it opted for a better armour by abandoning armoured belts and replacing them with armoured boxes, supposed to give a better protection against more or less flat shell trajectories. The sides of this armoured box were 54mm, with the deck above the armoured box being 18. AA armament was also enhanced by replacing the 75mm with 90mm cannons. The Foch also had a very different tripod mast to accommodate for French modern telemetry, and this specificity was used in the conception of its successor, the Algérie, a few years later. Used to track German radars, the Foch was integrated to the Force X in 1939, and mostly operated along the coasts of the Mediterranean and African, given that its autonomy wasn't really fit for oceanic operations. The constant hunt for the Graf Spee and its sister ships didn't bear any results, though, and after the Battle of the Rio de la Plata, both ships came back to Toulon. The evolution of the war stranded them there, until Italy declared war. The Foch participated in Operation Vado, and fired upon the industrial installation of the city of Genoa and the rest of the task force. The armistice stranded the Foch in the port of Toulon. During that time, it benefited from a few enhancements, most notably the addition of a radar and a few AA defenses. Ultimately, though, it was scuttled, along with the rest of the fleet, in 1942. The Foch had 8 203mm MLE 1924 cannons in dual sets, 8 single 90mm guns, 6 37mm guns in dual sets, and also 14 13.5mm AA guns with torpedoes alongside in 2 sets of 3. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Millie Draper, Juan the Panda, Nick R. Kupila, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie B. Young, Peter Grayling, Jerry Provolt, Bareen, Alan Hacker, Sem Arslan, Uncle Bean, Derek R., and Lafouche for supporting the channel.